Hello, guys, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Ruben's History Show. Today, I'm going to talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis or the Caribbean Crisis of October 1962, which was a confrontation between the two superpowers of the Cold War, the United States and the former Soviet Union, which is now Russia. It was kind of scary because it scared a lot of people between the United States and Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union started placing missiles in Cuba in 1962. Well, because the United States placed missiles in Turkey and in Italy. This Jupiter missiles in this Jupiter ballistic missiles in Cuba. No, not Cuba, in Italy and Turkey. That was during the presidency of John F. Kennedy, who was elected the president of the United States a year before the Cuban Missile Crisis happened. He was elected president in 1961 when Dwight Eisenhower's term as president ended on January 20th, 1961. And before the Cuban Missile Crisis, I would like to talk about the what happened before the Cuban Missile Crisis. So after World War II, if you remember, the Soviet Union and the United States were allies after the war, but then they became enemies because they started spying on each other for nuclear weapons, which is known as espionage, which means to gain military secrets on each other, on the Soviet Union or the United States or either side. So after the war, the Soviet Union and the United States managed to get hands on a map which had weapons, which had like missiles and stuff. And so Soviet Union and the United States started building up their missiles, and they still started building up this nuclear missiles and nuclear bombs and stuff, and this rockets for the space and stuff. So after that, they started building their weapons, and then in 1949, the Soviet Union tested their first atomic bomb in Kazakhstan. On August 20th, 1949, they tested their first atomic bomb in Kazakhstan, the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic, during that year in 1949. And the United States tested their first atomic bomb on July 16th, 1945, which they tested it in Mexico, during the Manhattan Project. So they got that map because the Germans had that map, and the Germans had a map of nuclear weapons. They had a nuclear project. The Nazi scientists did during World War II. And so after World War II, there was this deal in the space that was going on, which is known as the space race. During that period, it was a competition in the space between the former Soviet Union, which is Russia today, and the United States of America. So that lasted from the 1950s to 1970s, the space race between the United States and Russia, or the Soviet Union then, or the USSR. So in 1961, the United States elected John F. Kennedy. They wanted a president to be tough on communism. He was the youngest president to be ever elected as president of the United States, at the age of, I think he was in his 40s, I believe. I think he was probably around 44, 45, I believe, when he was elected president of the United States, Kennedy. And in April of 1961, the U.S. Attacked Cuba, they invaded Cuba, which was known as the invasion of the Beta Pigs. It was a failed attempt to overthrow Castro, who was the Cuban dictator during the 60s. And they wanted to overthrow Castro from power, who was the Cuban dictator of Cuba. when Cuba became a communist nation in the 1959 when Castro took power as the dictator of Cuba during that period. And then during that same year, John F. Kennedy met with Soviet Premier or First Secretary of the Communist Party Nikita Khrushchev in Vienna during that time, and they discussed about nuclear tests and the future of Berlin. That's what the two leaders discussed about the future of Germany, what was going to happen with Germany, and the nuclear tests. So that's what they talked about while they were in Vienna on June 4th, 1964, almost 20 years after World War II ended. So, and then a year later in October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis happened when the Soviet Union started delivering missiles to Cuba, who were the allies of the Soviet Union, because Cuba was a communist country and they started having relations with the USSR during that period. And Cuba was no longer allies with the Soviet Union. Well, I mean not the Soviet Union, I mean the United States of America. And Cuba became the first communist nation in the Western Hemisphere during that time. And Cuba still remains a communist country today. It still remains communism to this day still. So during that time, the Soviet Union under the leadership of Nikita Khrushchev started delivering missiles to Cuba, which was 90 miles away from Florida. So they started delivering nukes over to Cuba, and then days later, I think it was on October 16th or 15th, sometime like that, the United States spy planes spotted the missiles in Cuba, the nuclear missiles that Soviet Union delivered to Cuba. And so they took a picture of the missiles in Cuba. And there was actually pictures of it on Google and on Wikipedia. You could also check the pictures of it on Google and Wikipedia of the missiles located in Cuba. There's a lot of pictures of it on Google. You could see it. So Soviet Union started delivering missiles to Cuba, and the United States found out about it, and they brought the news to the United States President John F. Kennedy. And so Kennedy phoned Khrushchev on the phone, and he said, why do you have missiles in the Cuba? And Khrushchev said that, oh, we're only having them for self-defense. We're not gonna send a nuke over the United States or whatever. And so during his rule, they said that was now became known as the Caribbean Crisis, or the Cuban Missile Crisis. That lasted for 13 days, and then I think it was on October 22nd, 1962, John F. Kennedy addressed the nation about the missiles in Cuba during that period. And he delivered the news about the nuclear missiles in Cuba. And he told the American nation about it. And the Americans were kind of scared because the missiles could go to anywhere in the United States during that time. It could go to the whole United States, and it could destroy the whole United States of America and all other countries around the world. So during that time, I think it was John F. Kennedy or his brother, Robert Kennedy, met with the Soviet Foreign Minister, Andrei Gromyko, about the missiles in Cuba. And then it was sometime in October, I believe, one of the Soviet admirals were in a submarine near Cuba, and two of the Soviet generals, the admirals on the submarine, all pressed the button, but only one admiral refused to press the button to send a missile to United States, and that saved the world from nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union, which is now Russia today. So during that time in October of 1962, on October 27th, 1962, Khrushchev made an announcement to take out the missiles out of Cuba during that time. And Soviet Union took all the missiles out of Cuba, and they came back to the Soviet Union during that period, which was in 1962. And the United States took the missiles out of the Jupiter ballistic missiles from Turkey and Italy, and they took the nukes back to the United States. And they took missiles, and the Soviets took missiles out of Cuba. And the reason Khrushchev was removed from power 2 years later. 2 years later in 1964, as leader of the Soviet Union by Leonid Brezhnev. Most likely because Khrushchev had to take these huge risks during that time. And during that time about taking the missiles out of Cuba or leaving them there. And Khrushchev had to make these big risks about the missiles, and the top government officials, known as the Politburo, were kind of unhappy with Khrushchev. They didn't like Khrushchev, and they got rid of Khrushchev on October 14th, 1964, and he was replaced by Comrade Leonid Brezhnev, who became the first secretary of Communist Party following the removal of Khrushchev. And then also the Moscow Hotline was established in 1961 to reduce U.S. and Soviet tensions during that period. And a year later, in 1963, John F. Kennedy was assassinated while he was on a visit to Texas, a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis happened. And the world escaped nuclear war and World War III from the United States and the Soviet Union. And that is the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the event that almost started a nuclear war and World War III between the United States and the Soviet Union. So I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. Subscribe, and more videos are coming up soon.